Great. Now where are those punks who stole my stuff?
Something amazing about me?
Skateboarding video games have been around since I can remember. I've always loved them too. I could never skate to save my life in the real world, but I could always pick up one of the plethora of skate games and live out my dreams digitally. Many other gamers felt a similar way. While sure, it's not entirely the same thing, we could still live vicariously through the medium of video games. The world of gaming and skateboarding grew up together, and so it was only natural that these two worlds collide, especially as both skyrocketed in popularity. The early days of video games didn't see many skateboarding-style games due to the technological limitations. In fact, the first skateboarding game, often cited as 720 by Atari, released in 1982. But as the 80s rolled into the 90s, the skateboarding genre really started to take off. There have been plenty of skateboarding games released over the decades, and various console generations and platforms. Many of these games have seen critical and commercial success, and the genre has only grown larger and larger over the years. Even though the 80s gave us the birth of the skateboarding game, it wasn't until the late 90s that things really kicked off into high gear, with the deeply beloved industry standard that was the Tony Hawk Pro Skater series. Given its lengthy history, the skateboarding video game genre is an interesting trip in game design and gaming history. So grab your deck and tighten those trucks as we acid drop into the world of skateboarding video games. As I mentioned, Atari 720 is usually cited as the beginnings of the skateboard video game. Now, you can assume, given that it's an Atari game, it hasn't aged quite well, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. However, what Atari did with 720 was show that even for the time of the early 80s, there was huge crossover in audience between the two worlds, and both of these art forms have grown considerably in the 40 years since. In the early days, most games that included skateboarding were not really considered true skateboarding games, as often it was simply a feature rather than the whole point. Take that Bart Simpson game for example. In this case, it's a side-scrolling game where Bart can ride a skateboard to traverse the level. Again, not the primary mechanic, and more of a feature. These kinds of games helped provide a foundation for games strictly based around skateboarding, which paved the way for what was to come. For a while, these games were pretty niche, and to be fair at the time, so was skateboarding. But game developers kept taking a crack at the proverbial skateboarding egg, and some of these games excelled at tapping into the cult of skateboarding. A good example of this was the Skate or Die games released on the NES platform beginning in '88, with a second entry coming in 1990. Even Wikipedia comes right out with it, pointing out, at the start of the game, the player is armed with a paintball gun and a handful of weapons to throw at his enemies. It doesn't sound like a skateboarding game at that point, and to most, it may be worthy of a skip, but for me, based on that alone, the game sounds like it could be really fun. Sure enough, it is. The skateboarding genre would continue to chug along for the 90s, with a couple of games coming out from 1990 to 1999. ESPN Extreme Games would show the world what a 3D skateboarding game would look like, and while looking back, it ain't much, for the time it was cutting edge. This would also help the skateboarding genre of gaming pick up steam before it was about to melt gamers' faces the world over. In 1999, the skateboarding game would forever change. During the course of the 90s, skateboarding as a sport grew steadily, and by the end of the decade, the world was ready. Of course, I'm alluding to 1999's Tony Hawk Pro Skater. As I'm sure you're fully aware, this game and series was the de facto skateboarding game experience. For years and years, there was nothing coming even close to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and even to this day, it's a serious defining factor for skateboarding as a whole. The gameplay was tight and addictive, and players had a whole slew of their favorite skateboarders to play with, all the while jamming out to an iconic soundtrack for the time. It was a skater's dream come true, and frankly, even non-skaters. It was just so perfectly crafted. As I alluded to earlier, the Tony Hawk games endured a long time in the spotlight. For a while, it felt like these were the only skateboarding games coming out, and not many people were complaining, considering just how good they were. It started smooth with 4 mainline entries into the THPS series, all labeled 1 through 4. These games were absolutely stellar and really showed the world what the franchise was all about. It laid the foundation for what a Tony Hawk game was expected to be, and developed the blueprint for skateboarding games in general. Another important thing to know when it comes to the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater games is undoubtedly the music. For the time of the release, these soundtracks were absolutely like nothing else you'd seen in video games up until this point, with the licensed music introducing many new fans to different sounds, for the artists included. It was a match made in heaven. There was simply something special about skateboarding around this arcadey world, all the while jamming to your favorite tunes of the time. After the first 4 games, Neversoft, THPS's developers, would switch gears a little bit and develop a more narrative-focused Tony Hawk Pro Skater experience. This all culminated first with Tony Hawk's Underground, a game that would augment the Tony Hawk formula, and came out successful, and in some gamers' eyes, was a better product than what came before. First of all, the story focus was a welcome addition, and while very basic, is still serviceable and provides a new basis for a Tony Hawk game. Secondly, you could now get on and off your board to walk around, and in some cases, climb around, which opened up the traditional Tony Hawk gameplay to so many new possibilities. It seemed that these games came at a perfect time too, just when the series was starting to feel stale. While Bam Margera and the crew were popping off with their antics in Jackass, Tony Hawk's Underground 2 would center around this prolific skater and his iconic behavior. Players got to go on a skateboarding adventure through various locales across the world, all while getting up to some downright crazy shenanigans, and it seemed like the skateboarding game hit its peak with this one. Thug 2 doubled down on everything that made the first game so great. You got to play a more fleshed out narrative with an all-star cast, and of course, all the great features like getting off your board made a powerful comeback. Overall, Thug 2 was the complete Tony Hawk experience. The world just couldn't get enough, and of course, Activision would press on with the series. Even though Tony Hawk was dominating the skateboarding game scene, there was still other projects coming out sporadically. These include The Simpsons Skateboarding, my beloved Disney's Extreme Skate Adventure, and Tech Deck Skateboarding. All of these games could never hold a candle to Tony Hawk's dominance, but they do serve a purpose in their own right, at least providing some challenge for Tony Hawk's series to overcome. As I mentioned, these releases were sporadic at best, and most developers knew just how good the Tony Hawk series was and stayed far away. After Tony Hawk's Underground 2, players would get a few more installments in the Tony Hawk series before it would all go tits up and quality would drastically diminish. The first to follow up Tony Hawk's Underground were Tony Hawk's American Wasteland and Tony Hawk's Project 8. These 2 games are actually quite amazing, as you well would expect. However, they failed to capture the same size and kind of audience that the series had managed to in the past. American Wasteland did a lot to push the series to new territory. For example, it was the first Tony Hawk game which featured one massive world to skate through as you progressed the narrative. It did a lot of things right, but as I mentioned, it failed to capture the massive audience of Tony Hawk Pro Skater fans. It was also the first game in the series to feature online play through the PlayStation and Xbox Live services. Following up American Wasteland and the mainline Tony Hawk series was Tony Hawk's Project 8. I really like this one personally, and it's among my favorites with Tony Hawk Underground 2, and again would double down on everything that made American Wasteland so great, and kind of adapt it in a way that was more accessible to that core audience. Even though they weren't as successful as the previous games, they were still smash hits that entertained gamers the world over. By American Wasteland and Project 8, the series had made the jump to the next generation of consoles, being the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. This would also mark the beginning of the great decline of the Tony Hawk series, especially after the timed Wii exclusive Tony Hawk's Downhill Jam would come out. Downhill Jam would come out alongside Project 8, However, because of the timed exclusive, most players played it on the Nintendo Wii, and boy, this was a strange one. Though the series had been augmented over time and adapted to new audiences and gameplay mechanics, the mainline Tony Hawk entries still had a thread of consistency throughout them. However, once Downhill Jam came out, it became clear that the magic of the past was lost, and many gamers moved on to bigger and better things. Sadly, for many reasons, Downhill Jam would put the final nail in the coffin of the Tony Hawk series, sealing it for a long time. The Tony Hawk Pro Skater license left Neversoft in 2008 and went to Robomoto, who made a couple entries to the series that were met with utter disappointment, and it's clear that Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was dead in the water at that point. Thankfully, there was a project on the horizon that was going to capture skateboarding game fans once again, and depending on who you ask, actually blow the Tony Hawk series out of the water.
Oh my god.
When it came to the Tony Hawk series, the dominance was pretty long-lived. For 8 long years, players were spoiled with banger Tony Hawk game after banger Tony Hawk game, and all was well with the world. That was until Downhill Jam came out and everything would come crashing down and the series would go on hiatus. Thankfully, the year after Downhill Jam was released, EA, of all publishers, was about to grace the gaming world with the successor series to the Tony Hawk games. We all know these games and many still enjoy them to this day, but the series I'm talking about is of course EA's Skate. Skate was an unforeseen smash hit, and what seemed like an overnight time span, quickly it captured the hearts of skateboarding game fans, and it would drastically change expectations as well. Skate threw away the arcadey feel that made Tony Hawk's Pro Skater so great, and instead go with a more realistic simulation approach. The main mechanic that differed from its predecessors was that players would use the 2 joysticks to control their board, and EA really did an amazing job at making it feel fluid and addictive. When you pulled off a trick, let alone a line, it just felt so amazing, unlike anything Tony Hawk ever did. The Skate games would come at us in a trilogy, with the first game proving just how well this formula would work. The 2 that came thereafter didn't rework or drastically change the formula of the game, and instead doubled down and tweaked everything that made these games so incredible in the first place. The world was actually pretty large for the time and offered so many opportunities to really bust out some cool tricks. It also had a mechanic whereby you could move objects in the game to set yourself up for amazing lines and dope tricks, something that for the most part was not a feature in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater beyond the skate park editor. In Skate, you could do all of this on the fly pretty much wherever you wanted. Skate also featured a camera system which allowed players to film their own tricks and lines, which made the social side of Skate pretty impactful as players would share their experiences online, and they still do here on YouTube. Both series were majorly impactful in different ways to both gaming and culture. The game would also grow larger with each subsequent game in the series, and by Skate 3, it was massive, and there was just so much to do. For me and many others, these games struck a real chord and were successful in carrying on the skateboarding game tradition that was really established by Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. While both of these games are obviously skateboarding games, they played so drastically different that they are really completely different gaming experiences, with skateboarding at the center. Of course, no game is perfect, with the Skate games being no exception. There were plenty of professional skateboarders featured throughout the games, but for me, they didn't hit home as hard as those featured throughout the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater series. Probably because of my age or simply falling out of the loop, I just couldn't resonate with them half as much. Nothing on their part particularly. Furthermore, the Skate games can be really buggy at times, and the physics were quite whack as well. The physics might be a stretch to complain about, as many players use them to perform some absolutely crazy tricks that are actually really cool and only made possible by the Skate games. Overall, the Skate games took up the mantle left from the Tony Hawk game's downfall, and did it with such style and grace. Personally, I do prefer the Skate series as a whole to most of the Tony Hawk games, but considering they're both very different kinds of experiences, there is a plethora of fun to be had no matter what game you settle on playing. There is one thing to be said about the competition between these two series though, and that is the fact that when looking at the numbers, the Tony Hawk series was clearly more successful and had an insane cultural impact that is still felt to this day. Skate is amazing in its own right, but objectively, THPS was more successful. However, in the grand scheme of things, the Skate series held dominance in the skateboarding game genre for far longer than Tony Hawk did. With the initial release coming out in 2008, there wouldn't be a mainstream skateboarding game after for a long time, just over 10 years. There were random skateboarding games coming out here and there, but nothing could really hold a candle to THPS or Skate. It really showed how spoiled us fans were with these two gaming experiences, but eventually a couple games would come out that would reignite the skateboarding game rivalry and success. Like I mentioned during the industry dominance of Skate, there would be a few skateboarding games that came out throughout the years, but the skateboarding game scene was much like it was before Tony Hawk's Pro Skater came out. Sure, most of these are definitively skateboarding games, but they weren't as full-fledged or in-depth as Skate or Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Games like Ollie Ollie, Ramp, and Touch Grind would come out after Skate, but would go in completely different directions than what a fan of these kinds of games would expect. Touch Grind was an iOS-based game that allowed players to control their board with their fingers, which was definitely interesting, but as I said, nowhere near the quality of THPS or EA's Skate. It definitely was fun in its own right, and perfect for just ripping some quick tricks on the go. It actually ended up being relatively popular considering the platform it was on. I remember rocking this game in high school, just dicking around doing tricks with my buddies, all at my fingertips. But alas, Touch Grind was nothing too special. Another game that came out during Skate's reign over the genre was Ollie Ollie. This game would actually come at us in the form of another series with humble beginnings. Releasing in 2014 for the PlayStation Vita, having not played it, you could assume the graphics weren't cutting edge. That doesn't mean that the gameplay wasn't addictive and brought honor to the skateboarding game genre. Ollie Ollie is a side-scrolling platforming game that is high-paced and frankly fun. It's a clear inspiration from retro games, especially in the skateboarding sphere, and took more inspiration from the arcadey feel of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Players would assume the role of a skateboarder and go through various levels, attempting challenges and of course, racking up some sweet points for a high score. There are also challenges that players could attempt to surmount, and the gameplay loop was pretty challenging. The game was successful enough to spawn 2 more entries into the series that would come out years after the first, with the most recent being released in 2022. After the first game, it would be followed up in 2016 by Ollie Ollie 2, Welcome to Hollywood. This entry found its home again on the PlayStation Vita, but would eventually be ported to the Xbox One platform, introducing a whole new audience to the experience. The first glaring change that Ollie Ollie 2 brought to the series is the updated visuals. It still has the exact same retro feel and style, but the overall visual quality was drastically improved. Beyond that, there wasn't much of a difference between the first and second release, and it seemed the studio doubled down on everything that made the first game good. The nice thing about this series is that it kept things in the skateboarding game world alive, while the major series were all on hiatus. Finally, a third entry to the Ollie Ollie series was released in 2022, and even more than the second game, it changed everything for the series. While it was nowhere near comparable in popularity to EA's Skate or THPS, it still performed its job well. The game still featured the similar gameplay of the first two, but the visuals were again greatly expanded, and the style was also adapted to a new kind of realm. Instead of the 2D retro style, it converted to a 3D cozy style. I think this was an important change as it seemed to make the game more relevant for the time that it was released, especially considering that cozy games had already reached the stratosphere in popularity, with games like Animal Crossing's New Horizons. The gameplay itself, though, was far from cozy. While still a side-scrolling platformer, the game was greatly expanded and featured a whole new slew of levels by which to challenge players. The third game would also bring a narrative to the series that was pretty shallow but still serviceable in its own right. Overall, the Ollie Ollie series is not half bad. Of course, it's no THPS, but it was a solid entry to keeping skateboarding relevant during that time period. I mentioned in glancing at the beginning of this section, but another game that I actually enjoy, but truthfully didn't do much for the skateboarding game genre, was released during this time, and that game is Ramp. The biggest deviation that stands out in this game is that instead of focusing on that street aspect that pretty much every skateboarding game focused on, it converted to a focus on the vert style of skateboarding. It's a simple game that you can just rip in some downtime and just get a few tricks in. It's nothing really to scoff at, but again, like Ollie Ollie, it kept things fresh enough for what was yet to come. As we went through the interim years and got all these smaller yet still good experiences, nothing quite scratched the itch like back in the day with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and EA's Skate. Thankfully, this would all change one fateful day in 2018. Little to fans' knowledge, a small studio was hard at work on a new skateboarding game experience. Easy Days Studios would release a game known as Skater XL in early access in 2018. I haven't played the game a ton, but from what I have played, it's absolutely stellar. The studio would continue to plug away at the game, tweaking and adding features fit for a skateboarding game. A game to take the reins from EA's Skate. Furthermore, even another studio had similar motivations in mind, and the following year, Creature Studios would release what they would consider a successor to EA's Skate, known as Session Skate Sim, into early access, which I actually have played so much and love just the same, if not more. By Session Skate Sim's release in 2019, the Rivalry had really kicked off into high gear. Both of these studios and their subsequent games would seek to take the mantle left in Skate's wake. They played pretty much the same, but offered slightly different experiences. Initially, Skater XL would focus heavily on the vert style, and Session from the outset was clearly focused on street skating, and still hold by the time of writing. The vert sections are still rough around the edges, but serviceable nonetheless. Anyway, these two games would butt heads numerous times in their pursuit to be the top dog in the genre. Personally, I enjoy Session a hell of a lot more, but that isn't to say that Skater XL is a bad experience by any means. Both games take obvious heavy inspiration from EA's Skate, and a little of the same from Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, but clearly their focus is on Skate. Finally, after all these years, after Skate 3, we had a real blockbuster hit in the skateboarding genre. In fact, 2, and once again, gamers' minds were blown. Before I get too deep into it, I guess I should come clean with my bias. I really do consider Session to be among the greatest skateboarding games ever made. Skater XL is definitely up there as well, but my vote goes to Session every time. I've just never felt so satisfied performing these tricks and lines in any skateboarding game I've ever played. Not to forget that it's moddable and gives players the opportunity to design a lot of their own experience. It just has a great foundation, and much like Skater XL, it's still a work in progress and receiving updates on a regular basis. Like Skate, Session features a camera/filming feature, which allows you to get some amazing clips, and I've used this to some extent on a video on this channel, and I've done other videos with it as well. Unlike Skate, however, this filming feature is much more robust and responsive, so again, it takes the cake. There are some caveats to Session, however, like any game. To begin, the vert sequences are still pretty rough around the edges, but you can still pull off some pretty cool things. Secondly, Session at the current time does not feature any grab tricks for the most part, and so it does feel a little shallow in that department. But like I mentioned, it's receiving regular updates, so hopefully this comes sooner than later. While I enjoy it, I can also see the physics being an issue for some people, as it can get a little wonky, and definitely when you bail, while it's hilarious, it's not entirely realistic. I don't consider that a huge deal because I don't think any skateboarding game has done it perfectly yet, so I still think of it as a step forward, but that just works for me, not for everybody. And finally, once you played a lot of it, it can be relatively repetitive, but thankfully there are mods to help keep things fresh and exciting. And of course, those updates that keep coming. Conclusively, both of these games are amazing and have so much to offer players interested in a simulator-style skateboarding game, akin to Skate 3. But of course, much better and more suited to the modern condition of gaming. If you're in the market for an amazing skateboard experience, you could do worse than either Session or Skater XL. Furthermore, these games exemplify the modern state of the skateboard genre of video games, as either one of them holds the top dog spot currently for most players. But EA is planning to shake things up further with a follow-up to their beloved Skate series with Skate 4. During the rivalry between Skater XL and Session Skate Sim, EA would throw a wrench in the whole thing by announcing their next addition to the Skate series, Skate 4. This would derail the conversation a bit between these two games, as many fans did not even know of their existence due to the developers being small-sized indie studios, and the lack of marketing for both games. EA comes along with the money spilling out of their pockets, marketing beyond all measure, and of course a passionate fanbase generated more than a decade past, and of course the announcement drew so many back into the fold. This time around, EA was going for an even broader audience with more than skateboarding, by also including freerunning or parkour. The announcement came with a pretty bare-bones beta test that for a while eclipsed the attention that Skater XL or Session was receiving, and the two games got put on the back burner, sadly. Skate would bring back some of the team that helped make the series what it was, and would even create a new studio to spearhead the game's development. I should say too that the game is not really called Skate 4, but it's a reboot of the series simply titled Skate like its predecessor. At the time of publishing, the game is still in playtesting, which, having played a tiny bit, I was not yet impressed. It was sad for me too, as I saw my beloved Session and Skater XL cast into further obscurity under the might of a now detested publisher, EA. Hopefully by the time of the game's release, the two can really update their games to blow Skate 4 out of the water. Just before EA would announce their re-entry into the skateboarding game market, the Tony Hawk series would take another half-assed stab at the market with a remaster of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 as a singular game. I say half-assed because it wasn't a whole new game, but the remaster was done quite well. It features the exact same gameplay, just brought into a modern scope, and added very little. All in all, it feels like a cash grab that just used the Tony Hawk legacy for an easy buck. Considering they haven't mentioned any more Tony Hawk games, I think it's safe to say this will be the last time for a while that we'll see him. Objectively, the skateboarding video game has come a long way since its birth on the Atari. The genre has grown up throughout the years alongside the industry. It had a rough start, but with many different titles, it's always been around and improving. Eventually, of course, in the late 90s, everything would change for the genre with the legendary Tony Hawk's Pro Skater series. THPS was an absolute cult phenomenon in gaming, and for many years absolutely dominated the skateboarding genre. The arcade feels, addictive gameplay loop, and obviously the skateboarding was frankly revolutionary. The series took the world by storm and changed so much for the industry and of course the skateboarding video game genre, and even the culture. Right as the fire under Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was dying down in 2008, another player would come in seeking to do what THPS did for skateboarding in the gaming industry in a different way. This was EA with their Skate series. Skate was another phenomenal game that went with more of a simulation approach to the genre, and was met with great success too. Skate once again changed everything for the genre, while not being too much of a cult phenomenon like THPS. I personally enjoyed the game more than a Tony Hawk game, but it certainly was a different beast. Needless to say, the series would go on to see great success, much the same as Tony Hawk did. The Skate series would continue strong and reign over the skateboarding video game world for a longer time, and during this period, a few titles like Ollie Ollie, Ramp, and Touch Grind were released. While these were full games, they did little to push the subgenre forward, but managed to keep things interesting and fresh enough while we were waiting for the next big thing. The next big thing would leave us in the state we're at now. First, Skater XL, and then Session would come along seeking to revitalize the gameplay that made EA's Skate so amazing. These spiritual successors are perhaps the best skateboarding games ever made, and content is regularly coming out for them through updates. Especially in my eyes, Session Skate Sim does so much in revitalizing and carrying on the legacy established by Skate and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and I couldn't ask for more. Overall, the skateboarding game has done so much for gaming and skateboarding. Both worlds seamlessly collide from time to time and bring with them a whole new legion of fans. The history of the skateboarding game has seen various ups and downs, with mostly ups, and the genre is constantly pushing forward. You could do a lot worse than any one of the games I've mentioned, and I hope even more big players enter the rivalry to push skateboarding games to the top spot again, like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater did all those years ago. Get out there and play a skateboarding game.